Continuing to read from the text, Communication in the Real World, an Introduction to Communication Studies. This is section 3.1. I'm going to start with the key takeaways instead of starting at the beginning of the chapter because I find these key takeaways to be excellent summaries of everything in the particular section that really matters, that you should definitely know. The triangle of meaning is a model of communication that indicates the relationship among a thought, symbol, and a referent, and highlights the indirect relationship between the symbol and the referent. The model explains how for any given symbol there can be many different referents, which can lead to misunderstanding. Denotation refers to the agreed on or dictionary definition of a word. Connotation refers to definitions that are based on emotion or experience-based associations people have with the word. The rules of language help make it learnable and usable. Although the rules limit some of the uses of language, they still allow for the possibility of creativity and play. Language acquisition refers to the process by which we learn to understand, produce, and use words to communicate within a given language group. This process happens at an amazing speed during the first 2 years of life, and we attain all the linguistic information we need to participate in everyday conversations, assuming normal development, by our early teens. This chapter goes from page 112 to page 120, so I just have to go back to page 112. And we have 3.1, Language and Meaning. Learning objectives. Explain how the triangle of meaning describes the symbolic nature of language. Distinguish between denotation and connotation. 3. Discuss the function of the rules of language. 4. Describe the process of language acquisition. Before I start, I should probably note that I'm a licensed mental health professional, and I've worked in this field for decades, and I've also trained as a speech-language therapist, so I have quite a lot of background knowledge about these topics, and I may jump in at certain times, but I'll try to stick to the text as closely as possible. The relationship between language and meaning is not a straightforward one. One reason for this complicated relationship is the limitlessness of modern language systems like English. Language is productive in the sense that there are an infinite number of utterances we can make by connecting existing words in new ways. In addition, there is no limit to a language's vocabulary, as new words are coined daily. Of course, words aren't the only things we need to communicate, and although verbal and nonverbal communication are closely related in terms of how we make meaning, nonverbal communication is not productive and limitless. Although we can only make a few hundred physical signs, we have about 1 million words in the English language. So with all this possibility, how does communication generate meaning? You'll recall that generating meaning was a central part of the definition of communication we learned earlier. We arrive at meaning through the interaction between our nervous and sensory systems and some stimulus outside of them. It is here, between what the communication models we discussed earlier labeled as encoding and decoding, that meaning is generated as sensory information is interpreted. The indirect and sometimes complicated relationship between language and meaning can lead to confusion, frustration, or even humor. We may even experience a little of all three when we stop to think about how there are some 25 definitions available to tell us the meaning of word meaning. Since language and symbols are the primary vehicle for our communication, it is important that we not take the components of our verbal communication for granted. Our language system is primarily made up of symbols. A symbol is something that stands in for or represents something else. Symbols can be communicated verbally by speaking the word hello, in writing, putting the letters HELLO together, or non-verbally waving your hand back and forth. In any case, the symbols we use to stand in for something else, like a physical object or an idea, they do not actually correspond to the thing being referenced in any direct way. Unlike hieroglyphics in ancient Egypt, which often did have a literal relationship between the written symbol and the object being referenced, the symbols used in modern language look nothing like the object or idea to which they refer. Let me jump in here real quick and explain what they're talking about. Let's use as an example this thing right here below the computer. In English, it's called a table. It can be called a desk. It could be called or referred to as a surface. It could be referred to in many different ways. But the word table can mean almost an unlimited number of types of tables or desks. Now, in Spanish, you might use the word mesa, M-E-S-A, to refer to a table or a tabletop or a surface. That's not a table either. It's just a word. And the letters that spell that word and the sounds that we use to make that word also do not represent the thing itself. Also in English, if you said mesa, it would not refer to a desk or a table. It could refer to a flat-topped plateau, a large mountain with a flat top. So what they're saying here is we use words which are symbols that are representative of the thing, and they are not the thing itself. People who speak more than one language tend to have more cognitive flexibility because they understand that the word is not the thing. Reading on. The symbols we use combine to form language, systems, or codes. Codes are culturally agreed on and ever-changing systems of symbols that can help us organize, understand, and generate meaning. There are about 6,000 language codes used in the world, and around 40% of those, 2,400 out of the 6,000, are only spoken and do not have a written version. Remember that for most of human history, the spoken word and nonverbal communication were the primary means of communication. Even languages with a written component didn't see widespread literacy or the ability to read and write until a little over 100 years ago. The symbolic nature of our communication is a quality unique to humans. Since the words we use do not have to correspond directly to a thing in our reality, we can communicate in abstractions. This property of language is called displacement and specifically refers to our ability to talk about events that are removed in space or time from a speaker and situation. Animals do communicate, but in a much simpler way that is only a reaction to stimulus. Further, animal communication is very limited and lacks the productive quality of language that we discussed earlier. This is pretty good because it has a picture of a dog and then it has the words for B-A-R-K, bark. So the bark of the dog is not that word, and those letters also are not that word because you could rearrange the letters in many different combinations. So the real thing is the bark, which is the sound. And I also want to go back to what they said earlier in this text, which is sight, sound, taste, touch, smell. So you have 5 senses. If you can't sense something, you can't process it. So we process information through our senses. So we first have to perceive something in order to even interact with it. As I noted in Chapter 1, Introduction to Communication Studies, the earliest human verbal communication was not very symbolic or abstract, as it likely mimicked sounds of animals and nature. Such a simple form of communication persisted for thousands of years. But as later humans turned to settled agriculture and populations grew, things needed to be more distinguishable. More terms, symbols, were needed to accommodate the increasing number of things like tools and ideas, like crop rotation, that emerged as a result of new knowledge about and experience with farming and animal domestication. There weren't written symbols during this time, but objects were often used to represent other objects. For example, a farmer might have kept a pebble in a box to represent each chicken he owned. As further advancements made keeping track of objects representing objects more difficult, more abstract symbols and later written words were able to stand in for an idea or object. Despite the fact that these transitions occurred many thousands of years ago, we can trace some words that we still use today back to their much more direct and much less abstract origins. I'm going to jump in again here and remind you that the printing press wasn't invented until about 1450. It's called the Gutenberg printing press. And just as all these letters on the keyboard, the printing press had movable type. So you had letters or words that they could put into a printing press and then roll ink across the top of that press and put a piece of paper on it and press it down, hold it there until the ink absorbed into the paper, and then they could make books and tracts or posters or things that people needed to read. Well, there wasn't that much of a need for reading because there weren't that many books, there weren't that many things to read. So it's a complete transition in human history after the Gutenberg printing press made mass production capable of printing things, because before that, people had to write those out with their hand. If you wanted to write a book, you would have had to write the book by hand. So imagine if you had a popular book such as the Bible and you wanted to print thousands of copies of it, you would have to have somebody write those thousands of copies. So the 1450 Gutenberg print with movable type changed human history almost as much as this computer has changed human history and the internet. For example, the word calculate comes from the Latin word calculus, which means pebble. But what does a pebble have to do with calculations? Pebbles were used very long ago to calculate things before we developed verbal or written numbering systems. As I noted earlier, a farmer may have kept in a box one pebble for each of his chickens. Each pebble represented one chicken, meaning that each symbol, the pebble, had a direct correlation to another thing out in the world, a chicken. This system allowed the farmer to keep track of his livestock. He could periodically verify that each pebble had a corresponding chicken. If there was a discrepancy, he would know that a chicken was lost, stolen, or killed. Later, symbols were developed that made accounting a little easier. Instead of keeping track of boxes of pebbles, the farmer could record a symbol, like the word 5 or the numeral 15, that could stand in for 5 or 15 pebbles. This demonstrates how our symbols have evolved and how some still carry that ancient history with them, even though we are unaware of it. While this evolution made communication easier in some ways, it also opened up room for misunderstanding, since the relationship between symbols and the objects or ideas they represented became less straightforward. Although the root of calculate means pebble, the word calculate today has at least 6 common definitions. The triangle of meaning is a model of communication that indicates the relationship among a thought, symbol, and referent, and highlights the indirect relationship between the symbol and referent. As you can see in figure 3.1, triangle of meaning, the thought is the concept or idea a person references. The symbol is the word that represents the thought, and the referent is the object or idea to which the symbol refers. This model is useful for us as communicators because when we are aware of the indirect relationship between symbols and reference, we are aware of how common misunderstandings occur, as the following example illustrates. Jasper and Abby have been thinking about getting a new dog, so each of them is having a similar thought. They are each using the same symbol, the word dog, to communicate about their thought. Their reference, however, are different. Jasper is thinking about a small dog like a dachshund, and Abby is thinking about an Australian shepherd. Since the word dog doesn't refer to one specific object in our reality, it is possible for them to have the same thought and use the same symbol, but end up in an awkward moment when they get to the shelter and fall in love with their respective reference, only to find out the other person didn't have the same thing in mind. Thought, I want to get a dog. Symbol, D-O-G, or the word or sounds of those letters put together. Referent, an actual dog, which could be a dachshund, Jack Russell Terrier mix, mutt from the animal shelter, etc. Being aware of this indirect relationship between symbol and referent, we can try to compensate for it by getting clarification. Some of what we learned in Chapter 2, Communication and Perception, about perception checking can be useful here. This is really important because this is what many teachers do not do. They don't do perception checking. They don't do checking for understanding. And so by not asking questions and finding out what the students think or what they believe the teacher said, or if they were even paying attention, the teacher runs the risk of continuing forward while the foundation for the understanding isn't there. Abby might ask Jasper, what kind of dog do you have in mind? This question would allow Jasper to describe his referent, which would allow for more shared understanding. If Jasper responds, well, I like short-haired dogs, and we need a dog that will work well in an apartment, then there's still quite a range of reference. Abby could ask questions for clarification like, sounds like you're saying that a smaller dog might be better. Is that right? Getting to a place of shared understanding can be difficult, even when we define our symbols and describe our reference. I think they could have used a much more simple example, such as, I'm hungry. Oh yeah, so am I. Let's go get something to eat. And immediately, everyone reading this text would relate to that because that's happened to every single person. The conflict is about to emerge when you say, yeah, let's go get something to eat. Because one person's thinking one type of food or one amount of food, or a taco truck versus a taco or a Mexican restaurant, or going and grabbing takeout versus sitting in a restaurant. So even though you have a shared understanding that you're both hungry and you'd both like to go eat, there's no agreement whatsoever unless you were to say to somebody, hey, let's go down to the taco truck on 4th Street and grab some tacos. Sounds great. Boom. You have pretty much all the understanding you want. Definitions. Definitions help us narrow the meaning of particular symbols, which also narrows a symbol's possible reference. They also provide more words, symbols, for which we must define a referent. If a concept is abstract and the words used to define it are also abstract, then a definition may be useless. Have you ever been caught in a verbal maze as you look up an unfamiliar word, only to find that the definition contains more unfamiliar words? Although this can be frustrating, definitions do serve a purpose. This book does something that I don't like, and it does that exact thing right there. It uses lots of unfamiliar words, and it doesn't help narrow down the definitions. And one of the words that they keep using, two of the words they keep using are concrete and abstract. The word abstract basically means a concept that you are thinking. It's something in your mind, whereas concrete is something solid. So people who are very good at abstract learning are great at learning concepts, things which you usually can't touch, taste, smell, see. They're things that are in the world, but they're concepts about those things, versus concrete means it's something you can touch. And many people have difficulty with abstractions and learn better when they have definitions or examples that they can actually relate to. Words have denotative and connotative meanings. Denotation refers to definitions that are accepted by the language group as a whole, or the dictionary definition of a word. For example, the denotation of the word cowboy is a man who takes care of cattle. Another denotation is a reckless and/or independent person. A more abstract word like change would be more difficult to understand due to the multiple denotations. Since both cowboy and change have multiple meanings, they are considered polysemic words. So poly, many, semic, words. Monosemic, mono is one, words that have only one use in a language, which makes their denotation more straightforward. Specialized academic or scientific words like monosemic are often monosemic, but there are fewer commonly used monosemic words. For example, handkerchief. As you might guess, based on our discussion of the complexity of language so far, monosemic words are far outnumbered by polysemic words. Another example is when I was younger, there used to be a really popular song by Jimi Hendrix called Foxy Lady. It's a really good song. However, it's mostly irrelevant at this point in time. My parents didn't really understand the song because to them, in the 50s and 40s, someone who was foxy meant that they were smart, that they could escape, or they could get away, or they could get away with something. And a fox is often difficult to find or difficult to track. So being foxy meant that they were sort of like a fox. Somehow, by the late 60s and early 70s, Jimi Hendrix was able to have a song called Foxy Lady, and being foxy meant that you were cute or attractive. I never heard of a man referred to as foxy. It was always females. And there were even clothing companies that used the word foxy, referring to cute. That was many years ago, decades ago, and I have no idea what would be meant by the word foxy in that kind of usage. So there's the dictionary definition of the word, and he's about to talk about connotations, but there's also this thing that we call colloquialisms. That's another fancy word, colloquialism. So it's a way to use a word that might not even be in the dictionary, and it might just be local to a group or local to a particular age group that uses a word in a non-standardized way. So it's way more confusing than the level of confusion that it already is. Connotation refers to definitions that are based on emotion or experience-based associations people have with a word. To go back to our previous words, change can have positive or negative connotations depending on a person's experiences. A person who just ended a long-term relationship may think of change as good or bad, depending on what he or she thought about his or her former partner. Even monosemic words like handkerchief that only have one denotation can have multiple connotations. A handkerchief can conjure up thoughts of dainty southern belles or disgusting snot rags. A polysemic word like cowboy has many connotations, and philosophers of language have explored how connotations extend beyond one or two experiential or emotional meanings of a word to constitute cultural myths. Cowboy, for example, connects to the frontier and the Western history of the United States, which has mythologies associated with it that help shape the narrative of the nation. The Marlboro Man, used in advertising. I'm not sure if it's still used or not, but that was something everybody knew when I was growing up. The Marlboro Man is an enduring advertising icon that draws on connotations of the cowboy to attract customers. While people who grew up with cattle or have family that ranch may have a very specific connotation of the word cowboy based on personal experience. Other people's connotations may be more influenced by popular cultural symbolism like that seen in Westerns. Another interjection, is I have a hard time watching TV, and I haven't had a TV since about 1984, I think. And one of the reasons is because I tend to be very analytical. I analyze things, I break things down. And every single time that I have ever watched television or movies or anything else, and they try to represent these people that they refer to as cowboys, I noticed that they're clean shaven. And being somewhat familiar with history, I know that there wasn't any razors and shaving cream and hot water to be shaving every single day. So when I see these cowboys who supposedly are out there on the plains for weeks or months at a time, and they're represented in these ridiculous movies and TV shows and whatnot, and they're all clean shaven, it just immediately makes it impossible for me to do that abstract thing, which is the temporary suspension of disbelief that you need when you watch those kinds of things. So you sort of suspend your concrete way of looking at the world and just say, oh, that person in that show represents a cowboy. I just can't do it. It's just too ridiculous. Language is learned. As we just learned, the relationship between the symbols that make up our language and their reference is arbitrary, which means they have no meaning until we assign it to them. In order to effectively use a language system, we have to learn over time which symbols go with which reference, since we can't just tell by looking at the symbol. Like me, you probably learned that the word apple meant what the word apple meant by looking at the letters APPLE and a picture of an apple, and having a teacher or caregiver help you sound out the letters until you said the whole word. Over time, we associated that combination of letters with the picture of the red, delicious, or green apple and no longer had to sound out each letter. This is a deliberate process that may seem slow in the moment, but as we will see next, our ability to acquire language is actually quite astounding. We didn't just learn individual words and their meanings, although we also learned rules of grammar that help us put those words into meaningful sentences. Sorry, but another aside. Here's the problem with English language. In Spanish, for example, the letter A makes one sound. The letter P makes one sound. The letter L makes one sound. The letter E makes one sound. In English, vowels have what's called an open sound. A can be that sound that I just made, A, and you'll notice that it's a closed sound. So as the air is coming out of my throat, I'm making this sound A, and I'm making this sound E. Those are vowels. Then we have what's called an open sound. A can be ah, and E can be eh. So you hear the breath coming out, ah, eh. A, it's a stop. E, I stop the air. P can make the p sound, which you do with your lips. And L is a very difficult sound to make. It's hard to learn like R. So you have ol and R. But you notice there's two P's. So if you were to spell apple, A-P-L-E, or A-P-L as a kid, apple, that makes perfect sense. It makes the A sound, the P sound, and the L sound. English is one of the most difficult languages to learn because we double up the letters, we have silent letters, and we represent these sounds in so many different ways because we've absorbed into English so many different languages. And it's a very difficult language to learn, whereas Spanish, written Spanish, is much easier to learn because it only has one referent for that sound. That's just something to think about. There is what's called the International Phonetic Alphabet, or the IPA, and as speech therapists, when we're transcribing speech, when we're writing down what we hear, we have symbols that we use to represent all those different sounds, and it's an international language, so that if we represent something in the IPA, another speech therapist or someone trained in the use of the IPA could read what we wrote down and could fairly accurately represent exactly what we wrote and reproduce it the way that it was meant to be sounded out. And the IPA is basically what's used in generating speech from text. The rules of language by the computers, okay? The rules of language. Any language system has to have rules to make it learnable and usable. Grammar refers to the rules that govern how words are used to make phrases and sentences. Someone would likely know what you mean by the question, "Where's the remote control?" But the control remote, "where's," is likely to be unintelligible or at least confusing. Knowing the rules of grammar is important in order to be able to write and speak to be understood. But knowing these rules isn't enough to make you an effective communicator. As we will learn later, creativity and play also have a role in effective verbal communication. Even though teachers have long enforced the idea that there are right and wrong ways to write and say words, there really isn't anything inherently right or wrong about the individual choices we make in our language use. Rather, it is our collective agreement that gives power to the rules that govern language. Some linguists have viewed the rules of language as fairly rigid and limiting in terms of the possible meanings that we can derive from words and sentences created from within that system. Others have viewed these rules as more open and flexible, allowing a person to make choices to determine meaning. Still, others have claimed that there is no real meaning and that possibilities for meaning are limitless. For our choices in this chapter, we will take the middle perspective, which allows for the possibility of individual choice, but still acknowledges that there is a system of rules and logic that guides our decision-making. Looking back to our discussion of connotation, we can see how individuals play a role in how meaning and language are related, since we each bring our own emotional and experiential associations with a word that are often more meaningful than a dictionary definition. In addition, we have quite a bit of room for creativity, play, and resistance with the symbols we use. Have you ever had a secret code with a friend that only you knew? This can allow you to use a code word in a public place to get meaning across to the other person who is in the know without anyone else understanding the message. The fact that you can take a word, give it another meaning, have someone else agree on that meaning, and then use the word in your own fashion clearly shows that meaning is in people rather than words. As we will learn later, many slang words developed because people wanted a covert way to talk about certain topics like drug or sex without outsiders catching on. Let me give you an example of that. Let's say that you were selling some drugs and the drugs cost $20. So the term dime bag has a reference, right? But that refers usually to an amount or a weight. And let's say that it costs $20. And so you'd say Jackson. Jackson is the president's face on a $20 bill. So if you were selling a dime bag for $20, you'd say a dime for a Jackson. And so you didn't actually use the language. So if you were being recorded or busted, you could say that you didn't actually say that, but you knew what you meant. So that's basically all they're describing here. We do this all the time. Language acquisition. Language acquisition refers to the process by which we learn to understand, produce, and use words to communicate within a given language group. The way we acquire language is affected by many factors. We know that learning a language is not just about learning words. We have to learn how to correctly connect the words to what they mean in a given context and be able to order the words in such a way within the rules of grammar for the language code we are using, that other people will be able to understand us. As if that didn't seem like enough to learn, we also have to learn various conversational patterns that we regularly but often unconsciously follow to make our interactions smooth and successful. A brief overview of language acquisition from birth to adulthood offers us a look at the amazing and still somewhat mysterious relationships between our brain, eyes, ears, voice, and other physiological elements. In terms of language acquisition, there is actually a great deal of variation between individuals due to physical and contextual differences, but this overview presumes typical development. That's really important because a lot of this book does not really relate to the way people with autism, depending on the severity of autism that they have, interact with the world. Much is being taken in during the first year of life as brain development accelerates and senses are focused and tuned. Primary caregivers are driven almost instinctively to begin instilling conversational abilities in babies from birth. As just about anyone who has spent time around a baby during this phase of rapid development can attest, there is a compulsion to interact with a child, which is usually entertaining for adult and baby. This compulsion isn't random or accidental, and we would be wrong to assume that our communication is useless or just for fun. We would also be wrong to assume that language acquisition doesn't begin until a baby says his or her first words. By the time this happens, babies have learned much through observation and practice about our verbal communication and interaction patterns. These key developments include the following. 2 to 4 months, babies can respond to different tones of voice, angry, soothing, or playful. 6 months, babies can associate some words like bye-bye with a corresponding behavior, and they begin babbling, which is actually practice for more intelligible speech to come. But during the babbling phase, basically, here's what we think happens. The sound frequencies that we generate when we speak are perceived as sound. So when a baby hears these sound frequencies and tries to mimic them, you'll notice that even though the baby's reproduction of the sound isn't the sound itself, but it generally tends to have the same frequency. So if you listen to a young baby reproducing sounds, so when the mom says doggy, doggy, you might hear the baby saying something like huh, huh, and you can track those frequencies. And what's amazing is that in the first year of human life, if you were to put a baby in a room and try to record every sound that it makes and every sound that it perceives or hears, assuming normal hearing, you can actually put sensors all over the baby's head and read the brain waves. A human baby before the age of about 18 months can reproduce any sound that is in the realm of human language, and it can detect. It can't reproduce the sound, but it can detect the different sounds. However, after about the age of 2.5 years, what happens through brain development is that certain sounds that do not exist in that baby's native language or culture simply fall off. And so the ability to detect those sounds literally disappears. And the ability to detect the sounds that do appear and are necessary become heightened. And this is where you get into the difference between a native speaker and a non-native speaker. A native speaker can hear sounds that a non-native speaker cannot hear, and they can detect the finest of differences, and that ability falls off at about 2.5 years. So if you wanted to have a baby that could reproduce sounds like a native speaker, and you were living, let's say, here in the United States, and you were teaching the baby English, but you wanted later on for the baby to be able to speak Spanish like a native, one thing you could do is play Spanish-speaking radio or Spanish-speaking television or Spanish-speaking whatever in the background, so that the baby continues to hear those sounds, and it will learn those sounds like a native speaker. And when it gets older, it might be able to sound so authentic that people would say, oh, wow, you must have been raised in a culture or somewhere where people spoke Spanish. That doesn't need to be true. The parents don't need to be able to speak Spanish at all. The same would be true for hoping that your child later on would learn Japanese or Chinese or some other language. You would have to expose the child to those sounds before the age of 2.5 on a regular basis for that to be in their brain development. 8 to 10 months, babies learn that pointing can attract or direct attention, and they begin to follow adult conversations, shifting eye contact from one speaker to the next. That's one thing we look for in diagnosing autism is they either don't point or they don't respond to pointing, and they don't seem to understand it. It's not a complete rule in or rule out, but it is something we look for. 1 year, babies recognize some individual words, people's names, no, and basic rituals of verbal interaction such as question, pause, answer, and various greetings. Shortly before or after this time, babies begin to use melodic utterances, echoing the variety in pitch and tone in various verbal interactions such as questioning, greeting, or wanting. Now, it's important to know that this doesn't develop at 1 year. The babies recognize these sounds from birth. They simply don't have the capacity to echo or mimic or make those sounds because the development of the mouth, the development of the nasal cavity, you breathe in through your nose or your mouth, but they connect at the back of your throat. The ability to control the tongue, the development of teeth, and the ability to make those sounds has to come with human development and human growth versus they definitely recognize those sounds from birth. And that's been proven over and over again with scientific studies. You basically just look at the brain waves in response to the different sounds that are out there, and they clearly do recognize different sounds. Language acquisition after the age of 2 seems sluggish compared to the pace of development during the first year or so. By the end of the first year, babies have learned most of the basic phonetic components. Phonetic, just think of the concept of phone. Basically, it's sound. Phonetic components necessary for speech. The second year represents a time of intense practice of verbal trial and error. From 3 to 5, we continue to develop our pronunciation ability, which develops enough by our teens to allow us to engage in everyday communication. Of course, our expressive repertoire, so you have expressive speech, that's what you produce, and receptive, that's what you take in. Including ways of speaking and the vocabulary we use continues to develop. A person's life and career choices determine to a large degree how much further development occurs, but the language abilities we have acquired can decrease or disappear as a result of disease or trauma. Additionally, if such things occur early in life or before birth, the process of language acquisition can be quite different. Barriers to speech and language acquisition are common and are the domain of a related but distinct field of study often housed in departments of communication sciences and disorders. The Getting Real box feature discusses this field of study and related careers. Getting Real, Communication Sciences and Disorders. The field of communication sciences and disorders includes career paths in audiology and speech-language pathology. I'm telling you, audiology is a fascinating field. It's really fascinating how we perceive sound. That's a specialty in and of itself. And speech language pathology. They can be contained within the same professional, but usually you're going to break out and specialize in audiology, and then you can specialize in speech language pathology, and then you can specialize in subspecialties of that. For example, working with stroke victims or brain trauma, or even autism, where people are nonverbal and you have to teach them ways to communicate in using language, such as maybe they would point to a picture of an apple, and if they were hungry, they would point at the apple, or they would point at the strawberry. Or you want to try and transition kids from being in the classroom to going to lunch or going out to recess, and so you take them over to a communication board, and you point and lets them know what you're trying to communicate, because it's very, very difficult. Testing for hearing on children who are nonverbal or who are very, very young is a specialty. It's a very difficult, because you can't always be sure that they even hear you, or that the degree to which they can hear is there. So good hearing or quality hearing is critical to language development, but in the absence of being able to hear, or the absence of speech expression, you can still work around that and teach communication. We will focus on the latter here. Individuals working in this field can work in schools, hospitals, private practice, or in academia as researchers and professors. Speech and language disorders affect millions of people. Between 6 and 8 million people in the United States have some kind of language impairment, ranging from stuttering. By the way, stuttering is not within the scope of practice of only speech-language therapists. Stuttering is the most widely researched topic in all of speech therapy, and they have not discovered what is the cause of stuttering. So pretty much anybody can work with stuttering, but certain things are within the scope of practice of speech-language therapists, and they work on it. But many people can work on stuttering. They're not really sure what causes it. And some stuttering is normal. For example, if I was saying something right now and I said the following sentence, stuttering to lack of that's stuttering. It's a disfluency of speech. It's a lack of smooth speech. But some stuttering is normal. It just because you have some language difference doesn't mean you have a language disorder. Speech-language pathologists may work with children who have exhibited a marked slowness or gap in language acquisition, or adults who have recently lost language abilities due to a stroke or some other trauma or disease. Speech-language pathologists often diagnose and treat language disorders as part of a team that may include teachers, physicians, social workers, and others. The career outlook is predicted to be very strong for the next 8 years as baby boomers reach an age where age-related hearing and language impairments develop, as medical advances increase survival rates for premature babies and stroke and trauma victims, and as schools continue to grow. Speech-language pathologists often obtain graduate degrees. I'm not sure that you can get into the field without a graduate degree. Complete clinical experiences, again, that's usually required, and take tests for various certifications and licenses. Indeed, that's all true. To be successful in this field, individuals must have good interpersonal communication skills to work with a variety of clients and other service providers. Speech-language pathology, if I'm not mistaken, has been in the top 50 or so careers for many years, and it's gone up as high as, I think, number 25 in the top 100. And I've seen it go down to all the way out of the top 75, but it usually floats in that middle range. It's a pretty consistent field because basically the ability to communicate is one of your core abilities. You have to have the ability to eat, sleep, drink, communicate, and anything that interferes with your ability to communicate doesn't give you a level playing field, so it's considered a foundational right. And if you cannot communicate and that's identified early in life, the school system usually has to provide you with services. So you need a speech certified licensed practitioner to diagnose whether or not a speech language delay or disorder does exist, and then to implement a plan. So one of the reasons why it's a good field to get into if you're interested in that is that the school systems provide those services, so there's plenty of customers, and the people paying for it is the schools. Typical salaries range from $58,000 a year, working in elementary schools, $70,000 for those in healthcare settings. It's quite a bit more than that. This book was written in 2016, and that was almost 10 years ago. What specific communication skills do you think would be important for a speech language pathologist, and why? The motto for the American Speech Language Association, making effective communication a human right, accessible and achievable for all. How does this motto relate to our discussion of communication ethics so far? By the way, the American Speech Language Hearing Association's scope of practice is dozens of pages. There's just so many things you can do, but you're not going to get into a graduate school. It's got to get a bachelor's degree, then you got to get accepted into a graduate school unless you have really good grades. It doesn't mean that you need to be some sort of a scholar in language or some sort of like an English teacher type person, because you're really working with people face to face. You might be working in hospitals on swallowing disorders. You might be working with people who have Parkinson's disease, for example, and they have difficulty breathing or drawing a deep breath, and so they can't produce speech. You can work in so many different settings in that field, but it is a little difficult to get into graduate school. So if it's something you're interested in, it requires some planning ahead. All right, back to the key takeaways. It's the end of the chapter. The triangle of meaning is a model of communication that indicates the relationship among a thought, symbol, and referent, and highlights the indirect relationship between the symbol and the referent. The model explains how for any given symbol there can be many different referents, which can lead to misunderstanding. Denotation refers to the agreed on or dictionary definition of a word. Connotation refers to definitions that are based on emotion or experience-based associations people have with the word. The rules of language help make it learnable and usable. Although the rules limit some of the uses of language, they still allow for the possibility of creativity and play. Obviously, rap music or some kind of way of communicating that breaks all the rules still communicates. Language acquisition refers to the process by which we learn to understand, produce, and use words to communicate within a given language group. This process happens at an amazing speed during the first 2 years of life, and we attain all the linguistic information we need to participate in everyday conversations, assuming normal development by our early teens. And there's some exercises. Trace the history of a word, its etymology, like we did with calculate earlier in the chapter. Discuss how the meaning of the word, the symbol, has changed as it has gotten further from its original meaning. Two interesting words to trace are hazard and phony. I would suggest that you might want to look at the development of letters. That's actually a fascinating concept too. The letter S, for example, is thought to represent a snake, and the snake makes the sound of S. And so we think that that's one letter that basically has this structure that represents the thing, the snake. So the history of letters is actually quite fascinating too. Apply the triangle of meaning to a recent message exchange you had in which differing reference led to misunderstanding. What could you have done to help prevent or correct the misunderstanding? Think of some words that have strong connotations for you. How does your connotation differ from the denotation? How might your connotation differ from another person's? And that's it for section 3.1. Thank you.